Esther Awuni, many thanks for joining us. On today's show, we'll explore some opportunity sectors to consider when thinking of investing in Africa. As always, you can join the conversation with the hashtag Beyond Markets. You can also send your thoughts and your comments to my Twitter handle too. It's at Esther O. Awuni. Now, a recent report breaks down 5 key opportunity sectors to consider when thinking of investing on the continent. Ogie Williams, Advisory Unit Consultant at Adams.Adams, joins me to break down or unpack these sectors. Ogie, thank you for your time today. Let's get right to it. It's quite interesting that there is no doubt that Africa is considered a frontier of opportunities. And obviously, a lot of cash, especially private sector cash, needs to go into critical sectors for development. We're seeing that happening already. We're seeing quite a number of FDI coming into onto the continent. We've seen a significant amount of interest also towards the continent and going into key sectors. But it's just also interesting at the same time that there is so much more FDI that still needs to come in. Talk to us about how Africa is attracting this much needed capital and private sector interest.
There are obviously quite a number of opportunity segments within the African economy and industry more holistically, but our report looked to focus on 5 specific sectors, namely agriculture, energy, transportation, healthcare and ICT. Those are going to be some of the more backbone infrastructure-related sectors going into the next 5 to 10 years. And obviously, African governments have placed a lot of emphasis on structuring development around these infrastructure projects. Some of them large scale, some of them more smaller and medium-sized projects, but nonetheless, there has been movement on the various sector developments. Obviously, there is a strong need, for example, for us to strengthen electricity access across Africa. So it has been quite high on the agenda for African governments. A number of international financial institutions as well as foreign governments have become involved in this venture, particularly through large-scale projects in the hydro space, but also more in terms of decentralized power generation on microgrid scale, essentially trying to electrify rural areas in Africa. What we're also seeing is investment flowing into the ICT space. Naturally, we want to try and ensure that Africa is as connected as possible, as quickly as possible, and moving through the tranches of 2G through to 3G, 4G, and even 5G technology. There have been developments there, but again, it's quite confined to urbanized centers. So the major telecoms operators across the continent are still moving very slowly on rural connectivity, but LTE networks should strengthen that in the coming years. But again, a lot of it comes down to financing and availability of investment coming from foreign donors. Nonetheless, we are seeing developments in that space. Strong emphasis on agriculture development as well as strengthening transportation networks, particularly rail, as that has been quite a linchpin in terms of strengthening trade throughout the continent.
Absolutely. But okay, I'd like us to go through those sectors, key sectors, 5 of them, one after the other, and just take a deep dive into each sector, talk about some of the challenges that still persist, but at the same time, those opportunities that are glaring, hopefully, to investors. Let's start with agriculture now. This is obviously very critical on the continent. Africa still holds 60% of the world's arable land, and unfortunately, not a significant percentage is being used at the moment. If you talk about just the levels of irrigation alone, I think that's somewhere around 2% or so, according to this report. So obviously, there's an opportunity here. But let's quickly hear your thoughts on those challenges that you see that still persist, and how these challenges are at the same time opportunities that investors can take advantage of.
So there is a lot of emphasis on the agriculture space. It is a key employer across the continent in terms of labor force. However, there is a considerable lack of development of the land. So although 60% is arable, a very small proportion of that is actually being irrigated and ready for cultivation. So one of the challenges that we've assessed in terms of our report is that there is a lack of skills transference, as well as new and advanced methods of actually farming and strengthening the agriculture space. Digitalization has started to actually play a much larger role, especially through mobile applications that can do a variety of things, including predict weather patterns, assess market prices of various crops, and also be able to provide small-scale farmers with an avenue to market. So that those are some of the developments that are taking place in the agriculture space. But in terms of opportunities, there is a strong opportunity to actually get into skills development and training of small-scale farmers if we start to actually emphasize their participation in the agriculture space and not only relying on large-scale production of different crops. There is space for also additional employment within the area of agriculture. Again, it comes down to having sufficient investment and the willpower from governments to also align policy development with the trajectory of where the agriculture space is going in Africa. Naturally, the rest of the world is going to be looking to Africa as a key source of food production and food security going into the next 10 to 20 years. But we also need to take into account how do we mitigate, for example, climate change and challenges that will come with it. There's a lot of susceptibility of farmers across the continent to be completely wiped out should there be a natural disaster or an event that's out of their control. But what it comes down to is the ability to actually channel financing into the right places and ensure that there's sufficient skills development and training for those farmers across Africa. The step that comes after that is also having markets to trade. So one area that would definitely strengthen this opportunity is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Now, with the oncoming of this agreement, there is scope for countries that are very agrarian-based and very strongly dependent on their agriculture space to actually get into the market. But again, there is a need to balance out the scales between those that are mass-producing and those that are still in the infancy stages of developing their agriculture sector.
I just wanted to quickly just point out one challenge that you highlighted in your report, and that is unfavorable land policies and regulatory bottlenecks. Now, I want to believe that, there is a general awareness and appreciation for government's role when it comes to ensuring that the operating environment is favorable and the policies are geared towards supporting this sector. Would you say that even though this challenge persists, that there is still considerable traction when it comes to government realizing or actually putting their money where their mouth is in terms of ensuring that policies are changing towards being more supportive to farmers? Would you say that are you encouraged by the change, if at all that's happening?
I think that's quite market dependent, Esther, but we are seeing that the governments are coming to the table and trying to make the environment a lot more conducive for international investors. I think one of the biggest issues is ownership, and it persists not only in pockets of countries across the continent, but it's actually quite prevalent across the entire Africa. Essentially, governments don't want to be providing ownership of land to foreign investors and essentially allowing them to then control the distribution and production of various crops. We also want to be able to bring in small-scale farmers, as I say, but also be able to, in 5 to 10 years, take those small-scale farmers and actually move them through the value chain towards larger-scale production. Production en masse will allow us more opportunities to global markets in terms of price parity and competitiveness. So policy certainty and regulations is quite a hot talking point within the agriculture space, but there are encouraging signs that governments are coming to the table, some more so than others, depending on what scope there is to develop the agriculture space. But again, a lot depends on where the investment is being channeled. So if the policies are specifically targeting certain crops or value addition within the agri-processing space, there is scope and there is a lot of encouraging movement. But when it comes to the simple imports and distribution of raw fruit and vegetables and other crops, there's less feasibility of that. And what we're seeing is some governments are actually putting in place protectionist measures in order to try and protect their markets from foreign entrants and imports of foods. What we've seen is certain markets have put a price cap on maize, for example, like Zambia. Nigeria, for example, has also tried to limit imports of food to try and stimulate local production. We're also seeing some of the biggest cocoa producers on the continent, namely the Ivory Coast and Ghana, looking to actually try and control or direct the price of cocoa so that they have more say in the global markets. So a lot of encouraging movements, but there's also certain policies that are still in place to try and ensure that African agriculture space is protected from international investors, that they've got a lot more capital available and a lot more skills and knowledge to actually start up mass production facilities. There's obviously scope for the exclusion of smaller farmers in that regard, so it's a very fine balancing act, but overall it has been encouraging in the last few years, and we hope to see more of this going forward.
Okay, let's quickly move on to another sector, energy, very key on the continent. We know that when it comes to universal access to power or electricity, Africa continues to rank quite low, especially in the rural areas where many huge populations still do not have access to electricity. Now, let's just maybe one or two challenges. We know that there's been a lot of investments going in. Nigeria, for example, has a number of programs in partnership with the private sector to enable access to electricity, especially in the rural areas. But let's hear your thoughts on the major challenge and, of course, the opportunity that comes with it.
Well, access to rural areas is one of the biggest challenges. The reason being because if you have large-scale projects that are in certain locations, be they coal or hydropower, you still need to develop the transmission and distribution networks to actually get the power to those areas that need it most. So what we're seeing is, although the governments have put in place these projects, their rollout time and time to completion is considerably stretched out if you had to look at it in relation to when there's actually going to be access on the ground. So one of the biggest things that various governments across the world and organizations have tried to address in this regard is actually setting up a decentralized off-grid power generation capacity. So what we're seeing is a lot smaller, more agile power generating, especially in the renewable space, actually being developed across Africa, especially in the solar PV space, but also concentrated solar power. So what that will do in the longer run, or the medium to longer term, is allow quicker access to those rural areas. And depending on how grid dynamics work and how transmission and distribution networks are actually set up, those power generation spots are then connected to the main grid at a later stage, and it becomes a lot more dynamic in terms of the flow of power. It's no longer one way, it becomes two-way, where grids that are producing in certain rural locations are actually able to sell excess back to the main grid. It also regulates the power of electricity in that sense, and allows affordability to be considerably increased. But again, what we're seeing is that there is a need for further investment in that regard, but there is also a need for governments to loosen regulatory constraints in some spaces. There has been a certain level of reluctance to actually bring on board these renewable energy power producers. One key example that we can see is South Africa itself, where the central power utility is actually controlling 90% of the grid, and only about 5% is directed towards renewable energy capacity. But in this particular case, a lot of that is also tied into the natural resource which you use to generate power, in this case being coal, and also the knock-on impact that that's going to have on the mining space if there's a reduced demand for coal, for example, in South Africa. But if we go further afield into the rest of Africa, there's a lot more positive developments in terms of off-grid power generation. And what we're seeing in the longer term is, as I mentioned, these smaller, more nimble grids starting to pop up in terms of production in those more remote areas, and then in the longer run being connected to the overarching grid through transmission and distribution networks. The key challenge there is those transmission and distribution networks. There is opportunities for investment in that regard, especially in terms of upgrading infrastructure, like here in South Africa, for example, but also developing new build infrastructure, as is the case throughout many of the other key power generating countries across Africa. It's Nigeria being one of them, Kenya being another, but also going further afield into smaller countries like, for example, Ghana. Right now it has an excess in terms of power generation. So the next step within the energy space is actually interconnecting broader regional grids. So what we've seen is there has been stronger emphasis by African governments to interconnect the power pools in terms of the various regions across Africa, those being the southern, the eastern and the western African power pools. What we're seeing also in West Africa, for example, is in the coming months that there's going to be discussions in rolling out interconnectivity of the grid to allow that dynamic flow of energy which I was mentioning. So those are very positive developments, because in the longer run it will lower the cost of energy across the region in terms of the power pool. And it will make it more attractive for investors because there's that stability in terms of power generation, which is one of the key problems that is currently being experienced across the continent. In Nigeria, for example, a large proportion of energy generation is still very reliant on standalone generators. So if the power goes down, consumers are utilizing generators to power up their needs. And weaning off of that dependence is very much tied into having this increased access of energy through renewable sources. The cost of solar power, for example, has dropped considerably. And what we're seeing is countries like Kenya are maximizing that potential and looking at these smaller power generating units and then working on interconnecting their grid so that there is that dynamic two-way flow of energy. So access is increasing. We are seeing that development, especially in the renewable space. But I think that one area that we need to be starting to put a lot more focus on is the transmission and distribution networks across the continent. There's a lot of scope for upgrading of infrastructure, and there's a lot of scope for building new infrastructure.
Back to Beyond Markets. If you're just joining us, Ogie Williams, Advisory Unit Consultant at Adams.Adams, is our guest today on Beyond Markets, and we're discussing some sectors to consider when investing in Africa. Ogie, thank you for your time so far. Let's continue from where we left up, but we have to move to another sector, and that is telecoms. Quite an interesting sector. Obviously comes with both challenges and opportunities. We're seeing, of course, on the African continent, a higher use of smartphones. We've seen broadband penetration. So obviously, so much potential and so much opportunity for investors. But let's just hear you talk to us about one key challenge that this sector continues to experience, and of course, how this is also an opportunity for investors.
Mm-hmm. Similar to what I mentioned a few minutes ago in terms of the energy space, the key challenge is getting access to rural areas. The more that ICT infrastructure rolls out across countries, the more there's a need to actually interconnect those rural areas, because the more that they're connected, the more able that they are to participate in the economy of each independent country. What we're seeing is that infrastructure rollout is taking place. It is very much driven by government involvement, but also some private sector participation. Certain countries have opened up the space for private entrants a lot more than others. There is, again, that protection that's in place to ensure that local companies that are already operating in the space are not essentially taken over by the larger internationals. And what we've seen is that there is a considerable growth in terms of accessibility on the 3G side, and it has been moving so for the last few years. It is projected to cover the majority of the continent over the next 10 years, leading up to 2030. At the same time, slowly but surely, we are going to see the rollout of 4G and 5G bandwidths, as well as greater accessibility of LTE networks. So those developments are positive, and what we need to try and do is ensure that as the ICT networks are strengthened, there is scope for these rural areas to actually get connected. A knock-on or added effect of this increased connectivity is going to be within the financial services space. One major area that's been under development for the last few years, especially in East Africa, is the advent of mobile money. And what we're seeing is that traders are starting to utilize mobile money a lot more through platforms such as, for example, M-Pesa. We're seeing some of the larger telecoms providers also jumping on this. For example, MTN is quite big in terms of mobile money. And there's other smaller providers like, for example, Econet down in Southern Africa that's actually really moving at pace to try and capture as much of the mobile market as possible. So the two are quite connected. And what we're going to see in the next few years, what we anticipate to see in the next few years, is as the rollout of ICT increases, so consumers are going to have access to digital platforms to actually connect to the financial services space, which is a real positive, because that's another area that's very underdeveloped, especially in the rural segments. There's that very low bankability of individuals, and there's a lot more cash trading that's still ongoing. In terms of tax collection, it makes it quite difficult to actually monitor how much revenue is flowing through this economy, but it is sizable, and the more that we increase ICT connectivity, the more opportunity there is for pockets of areas that are currently being excluded on the basis of this lack of connectivity to actually start participating in economic development. So one of the key challenges, again, comes down to financing. If there isn't sufficient financing to come in with the various investors, it's needed on a local scale. And in many instances, there is that lack of financing from local financial institutions. So what we've started to see is larger regional financial institutions, like, for example, the Development Bank of Southern Africa and also the African Development Bank, showing concerted effort in actually participating in financing the space. But what we're also seeing is that larger commercial banks are also starting to get a little bit more innovative in terms of how they source financing from various areas of the world where they have assets, in order to ensure that financing comes from local entities rather than looking to source financing from larger international companies, like, for example, the International Financial Corporation as well as the World Bank. So those are positive developments. Again, skills transference is another area that could see a lot more investment and support, especially in terms of government setting up technology hubs. What we're seeing is, for example, the private sector, like big companies like, for example, Google and Amazon and also Facebook, are starting to generate a lot of interest in terms of setting up information and communication technology hubs across the continent. So those are very positive developments, especially on the part of Google. They're very strong and very present in that space. What would be good is if African governments are starting to increasingly work with these international tech giants, so that we are setting up nascent technology and developments to speed up this rollout of connectivity. And I think one big development is also Africa's first smartphone, which is the Mara phone. It's currently in the development stages in a cooperation agreement between Rwanda and South Africa in terms of the manufacturing of the phone. And should we be able to develop this technology, it will considerably increase the ability for African consumers to actually access smartphones. Projections indicate or suggest that by 2025, 2 in every 3 Africans are going to have access to a smartphone. And the more that this increases, the more scope that there is to increase their participation in the broader economy. And the more that we can increase their participation in the broader economy, the more that all sectors across industries are going to actually see developments. So a lot actually rests on the ICT space and the increased digitalization of information and communication.
I'd like us to wrap up the conversation with the health sector. We're almost out of time now. Now, obviously, looking at some of the challenges that you highlighted in reports, innovative financing is one of them. But I'd like us to talk about the opportunity of investment or investing in digital health technologies. Now, obviously, we know that just looking across Africa's key sectors, if there's one thing that can help the continent leapfrog is technology. Of course, perhaps also in the context of the 4th Industrial Revolution. Speak to us on the opportunity, I mean, just using technology, not just in health, but across all sectors to leapfrog some of those bottlenecks that continue to persist.
Again, access to healthcare is very much the same as access to energy, access to ICT. It's quite limited, and especially in rural locations where there aren't that many doctors available and nurses and also facilities, it becomes quite a challenge, whereby, for example, we see the spread of communicable diseases simply on the basis of lack of information, lack of education, and lack of ability to actually access those critical health services that you would actually need. So what we can see as key opportunities in terms of digitalizing the healthcare space is providing all of these services through online platforms, whether they be through a digital doctor or through a app that could potentially diagnose a simple ailment, or it could be through how do you access medicine if you're in a far-off location. Could you order that online, have a drone deliver that medicine to you, especially if you're in a rural location. So there's a lot of scope for digitalization to impact the healthcare space positively and decrease these instances of communicable diseases that could easily be prevented. At the same time, providing greater access in terms of education would, in a long term, ensure that non-communicable diseases, like, for example, HIV/AIDS, are decreased in terms of prevalence. And essentially utilizing digital platforms to leapfrog the challenge of building nascent healthcare infrastructure in rural locations, which takes a lot of funding and a lot of willpower from governments, and in many instances that is in short supply. But if we look at how we can utilize the digitalized space, there's a lot of scope for mobile applications to actually assist in that regard. And as I said, one of the front runners on the use of drone technology has been Rwanda, and what we're seeing is the increased emphasis of securing medicine and getting medicine to far-off locations using drones rather than utilizing road networks, which might be dangerous or underdeveloped and may take considerably longer to actually get the needed medicine to the people in rural locations. So there is scope, definitely a large-scale scope for the digitalized space to assist the healthcare sector and in the long run decrease the instances of both communicable and non-communicable diseases. And yes, a lot of it does come down to financing, but also a lot of it comes down to innovation. So going back to my previous point about the ICT space, there is scope for the two segments to actually work together in developing these mobile applications that will best serve the needs of the healthcare space in order to ensure that accessibility increases and the prevalence of various diseases decreases.
Absolutely, Oge. Thank you so much. Very robust perspective there. Thank you so much for talking to us today. We appreciate your time on the show. I've been speaking to Oge Williams, Advisory Unit Consultant at Adams.Adams, looking at or unpacking a report looking at 5 key sectors on the African continent, of course, looking at their challenges and, of course, their opportunities too. Well, that's it on Beyond Markets. Thank you so much for being a part of it. Remember, you can watch all previous episodes of the show on our website at CNBCAfrica.com.